Susan never imagined that at 70 years old, she'd be hiding in her own bedroom just to find a moment of quiet. Her sons, Patrick and Henry, had returned home from college in the spring, Henry with a chipped grin and backpack slung over one shoulder, Patrick looking more tired than she remembered. She had missed them. She had stocked the fridge, cleaned their rooms, folded their laundry, just like she used to. Patrick found a job within 6 weeks, some marketing firm downtown, but Henry struggled. Interviews came and went, each ending in a vague apology or no callback at all. Still, Susan remained hopeful. She told herself it was just the economy. Then, 3 months after returning, Patrick lost his job. She didn't ask why. She didn't press. Instead, she made his favorite casserole and tried to keep her voice light when he told her it just didn't work out. The next day, he slept until noon. A week later, Patrick brought a girl home. Alina. She had sharp eyeliner and a quiet way of looking through Susan instead of at her. Patrick made the announcement while Susan was folding towels. "We'll be staying in my room for a while," he said, like it was already settled. "Just until I'm back on my feet." Susan paused, one towel half-folded in her hands. "For how long exactly?" Patrick didn't answer. He was already heading back down the hall. The days after that blurred. Henry spent more time in his room, and Alina seemed to spend every second on the couch or in the kitchen, always demanding something, Wi-Fi passwords, coffee, where the good plates were. Then came the parties. At first it was once a month. Then every weekend. Susan began to live like a tenant, avoiding the kitchen after 6 p.m., keeping earplugs by her bed. She'd wake to red cups on the lawn, cigarette burns in the armrest of the recliner. Alina would stretch in the morning like a satisfied cat, laugh about the mess, and leave it all for Susan. Henry didn't help. Neither did Patrick. They'd vanished into their shared self-importance, playing video games by day and hosting friends by night, pretending this wasn't her house, pretending they were the victims of a world that hadn't handed them a career on a silver platter. Susan tried talking to them once gently, then again, more firmly. But each time, she was brushed off. Dismissed. "You're overreacting. It's not a big deal. Don't you want us to be happy?" What she wanted was sleep. Silence. Some small piece of her home back. Then, one gray morning, she woke with a pounding headache and chills. She knocked on Patrick's door, barely able to stand upright. "I need to go to the hospital," she said. Patrick looked at her, irritated. "Can't you call someone? Alina and I have plans." He closed the door. Susan stood in the hallway for a full minute before moving. At the hospital, the doctor examined her quietly, looked at her blood work, and asked gently, "Are you working a physically demanding job?" Susan laughed, just once, bitterly. "No, I'm retired." He didn't press. He simply told her what she already knew. Her body was exhausted. Malnourished. Dehydrated. Like someone who'd been working 2 shifts without a break. That night, she didn't cry. She didn't rant. She rode the elevator down from the hospital alone, stepped into a cab, and stared out the window the whole way home. By the time she stepped inside her house, something inside her had already shifted. It was no longer a matter of needing rest. It was a matter of survival. The next morning, she called a locksmith. The locksmith's name was Leo. Middle-aged, efficient, and with a look that said he'd seen more domestic battles than he cared to admit. Susan didn't offer many details, and Leo didn't ask. She simply said she needed all the exterior locks changed, including the sliding glass door and the garage. She paid in cash. "When do you want it done?" Leo asked. "As soon as possible," Susan said. "This afternoon, if you can." She returned home with a quiet steadiness, her steps slow but determined. Patrick and Alina weren't there. The house was unusually calm. She noticed they had left cereal bowls and an open milk carton on the kitchen counter. The smell of stale beer clung to the walls. Susan didn't clean it. Instead, she gathered their things: clothes, chargers, shoes, makeup cases, even an old laptop, and placed them neatly in 2 garbage bags. She left them just inside the front door. Then she waited. At 3:45 p.m., Leo arrived. By 4:30, the house was a fortress. By 6 o'clock, the sun had dipped, casting long orange shadows through the living room. Susan stood in the hallway, hands clasped, as she heard the familiar giggle of Alina and the lazy shuffle of Patrick's feet on the porch. Then came the rattle of the doorknob. Then harder. A pause. Then loud knocking. "What the hell?" Patrick's voice barked. "Mom, open up." Susan didn't answer. Alina began to scream. "You better open this damn door. We live here." "You don't," Susan said, loud and clear from the other side. "Not anymore." "What is this? Are you serious right now?" Patrick shouted, kicking the door hard. "You think you can just lock us out?" Susan walked calmly into the living room, turned on the lamp beside her recliner, and sat. The knocking became pounding. Then more shouting. Threats. Curses. Finally, after about 10 minutes of theatrical banging and disbelief, Patrick made a call. The police arrived within 15 minutes. Blue lights reflected off the front window. Susan didn't move until the doorbell rang. She opened the door to reveal 2 officers, Patrick behind them, arms flailing. "She locked us out of our own house," he barked. "We've been staying here for months." The officer turned to Susan. "Ma'am, is this your residence?" Susan nodded. "Yes. I own it. I live here. They were guests. I asked them to leave. They refused. So I secured my property." The officers asked for identification. Susan provided her state ID and the property deed she had placed near the door in anticipation. The younger officer scanned the documents, then turned to Patrick. "She's within her rights. If she asked you to leave and you didn't, she can evict you. This is private property." Patrick's mouth opened, but no words came out. Alina, still on the porch, sneered. "You're gonna regret this, you bitter old." But one of the officers cut her off. "That's enough, ma'am. You need to leave the premises immediately. You can arrange a time to collect the rest of your belongings if the owner allows it." "The bags inside the door?" Susan stepped forward, nudged them outside with her foot. "Here you go," she said. "Everything you need." The officers escorted them down the porch. Patrick looked back once, eyes hollow. Alina didn't. The bags rustled as they were dragged down the walkway like the end of a failed performance. Back inside, Susan locked the door and leaned against it. The silence was clean. No music, no shouting, no thumping bass or late-night arguments. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the chirp of insects through the open window. Later that night, Susan logged into her online legal documents and made one more change. She updated her will and removed Henry's name entirely. Not out of malice, but as a warning. Actions had consequences. She didn't owe anyone her life anymore. The morning after the lockout was bright, crisp, and still. Susan woke without an alarm. For the first time in months, she didn't hear footsteps stomping down the hall or the sound of Alina's voice shrieking over a phone call. The house had returned to its natural state, quiet, measured, and hers. She made tea. Real tea. Not a reheated mug left to cool between chores. She sipped it by the window, watching a bird flit between the maple branches. The day felt light in a way that made her realize how heavy her routine had become. For 6 months, she had bent herself backwards trying to be understanding, trying to be helpful, trying not to be that kind of mother. But the truth was she'd been used. And that realization didn't sting. It sharpened her resolve. The phone rang. It was Henry. "You really kicked them out?" he asked, no hello. Susan didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch. "You're serious?" he asked again, this time sounding both amused and angry. "Patrick says you humiliated him." Susan replied calmly. "Patrick can get a job. He can get his own place. And Alina can learn to use a mop. You didn't even give them a warning." "I gave them 6 months," she said. "I gave them a home. I gave them everything. And they treated me like I was disposable." Henry scoffed. "You're being dramatic." "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'm being done." She hung up. The call didn't shake her. If anything, it confirmed something she hadn't been able to say aloud until now. Her children had mistaken her kindness for weakness. Her patience had been misread as permission. And her love, her unconditional, aching love for them, had been trampled under muddy boots and empty excuses. But she wasn't bitter. She was awake. That afternoon, Susan opened the windows and let the autumn air wash over the rooms. She stripped the beds, vacuumed the floors, not because she had to, but because she wanted to reclaim her space. She aired out the stench of beer, smoke, and entitlement. The freedom was intoxicating. Over the next few days, Susan transformed her life one decision at a time. She unsubscribed from the daily guilt of being an aging mother. She joined a local yoga group at the community center and began walking in the park every morning, waving to strangers, chatting with the woman who sold bird feed outside the cafe. Every little act felt like reclaiming a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The neighbors started to notice. Marcia from 2 doors down dropped by with soup and a quiet curiosity. "Heard you had a bit of a shake-up," she said, not unkindly. Susan smiled. "Just took out the trash." Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. Most of them had noticed the parties, the chaos, the shouting. But no one had said anything. And now, as Susan walked past their driveways, they smiled with new respect. "You did what most people wouldn't dare," said Tom, the retired school principal from across the street. "Good on you." By the end of the week, Susan was sleeping better, laughing more, and eating meals without resentment simmering in her gut. She spent afternoons on the porch, legs tucked beneath her, knitting again, something she hadn't done since her husband passed. One afternoon, a letter came in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten by Henry. It was not an apology. It was a justification. He said she had overreacted. That Patrick and Alina were struggling, that they needed family support, that Susan had abandoned them when they needed her most. She folded the letter in half without reading the rest. Then she dropped it in the recycling bin. She didn't need explanations. She didn't need guilt. She needed peace. And now she had it. 3 weeks after Susan changed the locks, she found herself humming while sweeping the back porch. It wasn't anything conscious. Just a soft melody that returned to her like an old friend. The broom bristles swept across the boards, and the sound blended with the rustle of leaves in the maple tree. She was no longer waking up angry. No longer checking the house anxiously, fearing what mess waited behind the door. No longer carrying the tension of feeling like a stranger in her own space. It was astonishing how peace could return in layers, quiet mornings, calm evenings, the gentle return of her own voice. One evening, while watering the houseplants near the kitchen window, she saw a familiar figure parked across the street in a beat-up silver sedan. Patrick. He didn't get out of the car. He just sat there, engine idling, staring at the house, as if waiting for something. After a few minutes, he drove off. He came back 2 more times that week. Each time, Susan watched. But she never went outside. She didn't flinch. She didn't wave. She didn't acknowledge him. She had nothing left to offer. And that silence, the one he used to weaponize, was now hers to wield. Later that weekend, she found herself walking to the bookstore for the first time in over a year. She browsed slowly, her fingers grazing over titles, unhurried and curious. She bought a book on meditation, another on boundary setting, and a slim volume of poetry that reminded her of the person she'd once been. That night, she read a few pages aloud to herself, curled on the sofa beneath a fleece blanket. The only sound was her voice, warm and sure. 2 days later, she received a message from a blocked number. "Are you ever going to let us talk?" She didn't reply. What was there to talk about? They hadn't spoken. They hadn't apologized. They hadn't changed. They had only tried to knock down her doors, literally and figuratively, and when that didn't work, they reached for guilt as a weapon. But guilt had lost its grip. Instead of replying, Susan drove to the community center. She had learned the yoga instructor offered additional evening classes and decided to try one. In the dim studio, surrounded by other women her age, she breathed deeper than she had in months. Her joints ached slightly, but it was the good kind of ache. The kind that reminded her she was still alive, still mobile, still choosing her next move. After class, one of the other women, Janine, invited her for coffee. They sat at a small corner cafe and shared stories about difficult adult children, lost spouses, and the surprising liberation of old age. "You think when you retire it's going to be soft," Janine said, stirring her tea. "But it's a battlefield sometimes." Susan nodded. "But it's ours now. And I finally stopped surrendering." The next morning, Susan drafted a letter, not for Patrick, not for Henry, but for her lawyer. She outlined the changes to her will. Clear. Final. No ambiguity. She had already removed Henry. And now she revised Patrick's share. Not out of cruelty, but to protect her future peace. If they ever came back into her life, it would be because they earned it. Not because they expected it. She named her niece, a young teacher who'd always remembered birthdays, who once spent 2 weeks taking care of Susan after her hip surgery, as the new executor and beneficiary. By December, the house was ready for winter. Fresh curtains, a new kettle, birdseed stocked for the cardinals that visited the porch each morning. Susan kept her phone on silent most days. Not because she was hiding, but because she didn't need noise. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned. New Year's Eve arrived with a quiet frost, the kind that settled like powder on rooftops and caught in the crevices of old fences. Susan stood at her kitchen window watching the world shimmer, her breath rising gently in the cold light. She hadn't hosted anyone this year. No sons. No noise. No mess to clean. And yet, it was the most peaceful New Year's she could remember. She brewed a cup of spiced tea and stepped outside, wrapped in a thick cardigan, her boots crunching softly on the icy path. In the yard, the small solar lights flickered like forgotten stars, and above, the sky was wide and forgiving. Susan didn't make resolutions. She didn't need to. She was already doing what most people only dreamed of, starting over at 70. In the weeks following the lockout, small things continued to change. She began volunteering at the local library twice a week. She attended a painting class on Thursdays and learned how to use her new phone without calling her neighbor for help every 10 minutes. One day at the park, while feeding ducks near the frozen pond, she ran into Harold, an old friend of her late husband's. They hadn't seen each other in years, but conversation came easily. "You look lighter," he said. "Like someone who finally told the world to go to hell." Susan laughed. "Close. I just told 2 people to get out of my house." They met again the next week. Then again after that. Nothing romantic. Just coffee, walks, laughter. Someone to sit with. Someone who didn't want anything from her but her time. One afternoon, Harold helped her rearrange the living room. She donated the old couch, the one Henry and Alina had stained with spilled beer and indifference, and replaced it with a warm gray love seat. She added a new rug, pale blue with gold threads, and lit candles that smelled of cedar and citrus. "This place feels different," Harold said. "It finally feels mine," she answered. Then came the letter from Alina. It was handwritten, clumsy, trying too hard. Apologies wrapped in justification. A few lines about missing the home, about how hard things were. A veiled request for a fresh start. Susan didn't reply. She didn't even read it twice. She placed it gently in the fireplace and watched it curl into ash. There were no second chances for people who had refused to give her even one. Susan no longer needed to be needed. She had done her part, raised her children, paid her dues, cleaned the dishes, and smiled through clenched teeth. Now she was free. Free from obligation disguised as love. Free from the manipulation of guilt. Free to breathe. In early February, she hosted her first dinner in the clean, quiet house. Just 3 friends, Harold, Janine from yoga, and Nancy from the library. They brought potluck dishes, shared stories, and laughed over lemon cake until nearly midnight. When the guests left, Susan stood in the doorway, the night air crisp and kind. The porch light hummed behind her, casting a soft glow on the welcome mat. She didn't feel alone. She felt whole. She stepped back inside, closed the door, and turned the lock, not out of fear, but as a symbol. Her home was no longer open to chaos. Only peace. Only choice. That night, she slept soundly, wrapped not in blankets, but in the firm knowledge that she had saved herself. By March, Susan no longer woke up dreading the day. Her mornings were sacred. She stretched beside the window, brewed her jasmine tea, and opened her new journal, a gift from Nancy at the library. Each page filled slowly with small triumphs, new recipes tried, books finished, walks taken without needing to pause for breath. The house, once heavy with resentment, now hummed with intention. Every corner told a new story. The spare bedroom, once Henry's chaos nest, was transformed into an art room. She bought an easel and began painting again, quiet strokes of mountains, rivers, skies that reflected her inner calm. She didn't paint sadness. She painted silence. And in it, peace. Sometimes, she found old things buried beneath layers of memory, a jacket of Patrick's she forgot to throw out, an old photo tucked behind a drawer, the sound of a ringtone that used to make her flinch. These things didn't hurt anymore. They just passed through her like clouds. Not forgotten, just no longer in control. In mid-March, she received a formal letter. Henry was contesting the will change. The audacity didn't surprise her. What did surprise her was how little it stirred inside her. No rage, no anxiety. Just a tired shrug. She forwarded it to her lawyer and added a handwritten note, let him fight for something he never valued. Her attorney responded within 2 hours. You're protected. Let me handle it. And she did. She went to her yoga class. She had lunch with Harold. She bought a new sweater with deep pockets and didn't think once about saving the receipt in case someone questioned her spending. The following week, Susan found herself standing in front of a mirror at the community center, part of a self-defense seminar she had signed up for on a whim. The instructor, a wiry woman with fierce eyes, taught them how to shout "no" from the gut, how to stand rooted, how to raise a hand not in fear but in finality. That night, Susan stood in her hallway, looked at the space where she used to lean against the wall crying, and whispered, "No more." She placed her hand gently against the wall, then walked away. April came with birdsong and soft light. The garden, neglected since last summer, began to bloom again. Susan knelt in the soil, pressing seeds into the dirt like tiny promises. Tulips, daisies, lavender. Flowers that didn't ask for permission to bloom. At the library, a teenager approached her during her volunteer shift. He asked about a book, and she recommended one about endurance, something quiet but fierce, she said. He nodded like he understood. That evening, Susan sat on the porch, a blanket across her knees, a new novel open on her lap. Harold sat beside her, sipping tea. They didn't speak much, and they didn't need to. "You ever think you'd end up here?" Harold asked. Susan smiled. "Not in 1,000 years. And now I don't want to be anywhere else." "You did a hard thing." "I did a necessary thing." He nodded, and they watched the sky fade from lavender to navy. Inside the house, the lights glowed soft and warm. The rooms weren't just clean, they were still. Not empty. Not cold. Just still. And that stillness held her like a vow. By late spring, the garden Susan planted had bloomed into a quiet riot of color. Neighbors slowed their walks to admire it. Children pointed at the bright tulips nodding in the breeze. Susan tended to it with care but not obsession. Each sprout and blossom was its own little affirmation. You stayed. You grew. One Tuesday morning, while deadheading the daisies, she heard footsteps on the gravel path. Patrick. He looked thinner. His hair was longer, untamed. He held a grocery bag in one hand like a peace offering. "Can we talk?" he asked, hesitantly. Susan stood, wiped her hands on her gardening apron, and looked him squarely in the eye. "I don't owe you that," she said, gently. He nodded, eyes fixed on the ground. "I just wanted to say I was sorry." Susan tilted her head. "Sorry for treating me like a maid? Or for standing by while someone else did?" "I didn't realize." "You did," she interrupted. "You just didn't care. And then I stopped caring too." He didn't argue. He placed the bag down on the porch, turned, and left without another word. Susan didn't open the bag until sunset. Inside were chamomile tea, ginger biscuits, and a card. Not handwritten. A Hallmark apology, cold and generic. She placed the items in the donation bin beside the fridge. She didn't need apology snacks. She needed space. And she finally had it. That night, she dreamed she was back in the house during one of those awful parties. Music thumping, beer cans everywhere, strangers shouting. But this time, she didn't clean. She didn't yell. She simply walked out the front door and locked it from the outside. She woke up smiling. Over the next few weeks, she returned to her routines. Morning yoga, volunteer work, long walks. She was now helping other women at the library fill out online legal forms, wills, living trusts, advance directives. Many of them were widows or grandmothers quietly edged out of their own homes. "You don't have to prove your worth to stay," Susan told one of them. "You already earned it." They're the ones who forgot. By May, the will contest Henry had filed was officially denied. The court recognized her capacity and intentions clearly. Her lawyer called with the news. "You're completely in the clear," he said. "He won't get a dime." Susan didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just whispered, "Good," and returned to her tea. The next Sunday, she bought a bird bath for the garden and watched as robins splashed in it like children. She painted again, this time a wide field under a silver sky. No figures. Just space. A horizon that didn't demand anything of her. Harold had become a regular presence now. He helped with heavier tasks and stayed for dinner most nights. They didn't define anything. There was no need. Sometimes, companionship was enough. One afternoon, while walking the trail near the lake, Susan paused by a bench and sat down. The trees swayed above her, and the wind carried the scent of pine and water. She realized she had no idea what Patrick or Henry were doing that day. And she didn't need to know. They were no longer chapters in her daily story. Just footnotes in a book she had finally rewritten. Susan had never planned on being alone in old age, but now, as summer approached and the lilacs bloomed with reckless joy along her backyard fence, she realized she wasn't alone. She had herself. And that was enough. Every corner of her home now spoke her name. The once cluttered kitchen was organized with care. The guest room smelled of lavender and clean linen. Her bedroom had fresh curtains that let in the morning sun and kept out the past. One morning, she stood barefoot on the porch, sipping from her favorite mug, the one Henry once called Grandma Ugly. It was chipped now, but the tea inside tasted like victory. She had finally stopped mourning the version of motherhood that demanded endless sacrifice. Her sons were grown. Their choices were their own. She didn't need to carry their disappointments anymore. The final echo came in July. An email from Henry. The subject line was, "Can we talk?" Susan deleted it. She didn't need another speech. She didn't want to hear about how hard things had been, or how he didn't mean it like that. She had lived the reality. And reality didn't need interpretation. It needed boundaries. And so she maintained hers. That weekend, she hosted a book club at her house. 7 women, all over 60, with stories that overlapped and diverged like streams. Some had been divorced. Others widowed. Some still lived with grown children they were trying to push out gently, without guilt. They spoke of old habits, new hobbies, and what it meant to reclaim a life after decades of giving it away piece by piece. "You ever think about letting them back in?" one of them asked, cautiously. Susan smiled softly. "No, not unless they come back as guests. And guests bring respect when they enter someone's home." Everyone nodded. There was no debate. No doubt. The summer wore on like a silk ribbon, smooth, quiet, purposeful. Susan visited a coastal town with Janine and Harold. She learned to play the piano at the community center, slow and clumsy but joyful. She filled her days not with chores but with choices. And one evening, standing at the window as a light rain fell over her garden, she whispered a thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to herself. "Thank you for holding on. Thank you for letting go. Thank you for not staying quiet." The story of Susan wasn't one of revenge or spectacle. It wasn't about triumph in the loud, dramatic sense. It was about something harder, reclaiming dignity, choosing peace, standing the hell up, and locking the door behind those who confused love with convenience. In the end, the house stood calm. No music blared from behind closed doors. No footsteps trampled past her room. No voice told her to chill or relax or deal with it. She no longer had to. Susan had dealt with enough.
My grandmother told me this story. Thanks for watching this video, like and subscribe. Bye bye!